Instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens. Does that make sense, right?
Well, it does make sense, and you'll have all the experts saying that it's not possible. So we're going to go through the case here historically and pragmatically if it's something we can do today. Let me ask you this, because, you had the libertarians for a long time. They would always yell like, income tax is theft. And I understand, and I agree. But you got to bring quite a bit more to the table than that. And you've heard things like the flat tax, you've heard of the fair tax, right? There were different approaches, but certainly there have been proposed solutions in the face of this, what I would argue historically is a radical progressive tax. And there's a reason that we have a radical progressive tax. And that, of course, comes from the left. And it really goes back to, something that Karl Marx supported. So I want to be really clear about the fact that historically, and we'll get into the history, we haven't always had an income tax. And where we are right now is actually more unprecedented than what we had historically. Like this is actually sort of the outlier right now.
Yeah.
So practically, you think we can get rid of it? For a period of time, I thought, no, politically, you're not going to necessarily be doing that. And here's something I really want to point out. This conversation has been going on for a long time. This proposal, talking about this publicly, is the kind of proposal that could only happen in a Trump second term. A guy who does not care as to what people think of him, who does not care, that most people would say, hey, this is political suicide. Let me tell you why. 40% of U.S. households, they don't pay any federal income tax. So for anyone to go out and say, hey, maybe we should do with federal income, we should do away with federal income tax, they're not going to gain votes. They really only stand to lose quite a few votes, to be clear, at least 40%, almost guaranteed. That means that he thinks it's the right thing to do. Yes, Noodles.
I just want to correct, it was only 40% pay income tax.
Only 40% pay federal income tax?
We'll pay no federal income.
No, only 40. It's only 40% pay no federal income tax.
How dare you?
Well, yeah, and it used to be 47. Remember, that was Mitt Romney's political suicide. To give you an idea, in his campaigning, remember Mitt Romney said 47%. Well, how are you going to talk to 47% of Americans who pay no federal income tax? Everyone said, I can't believe that he said this. It was a huge blunder. That number's now 40%, and Donald Trump is saying, not in a secret video on the campaign trail, he's saying publicly, you know what? Maybe it's time to do away with the federal income tax. And he's making the case for it. Yeah. Again, you may not like it, but I don't know that I ever thought we'd see a president say this in our lifetime.
It's time for the United States to return to the system that made us richer and more powerful than ever before. Do you know the United States in 1870 to 1913, all tariffs, and that was the richest period in the history of the United States, relatively speaking. Teddy Roosevelt was a beneficiary because when McKinley was killed, he took over this vast sum of money and he did all of those national parks and all of the other things. And I'm not knocking him, but he was given a vast amount of money. And that was all made through tariffs. We had no income tax. The income tax came in 1913. As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens. Does that make sense, right?
Well, it does make sense, and you'll have all the experts saying that it's not possible. So we're going to go through the case here historically and pragmatically if it's something we can do today. And we also are dealing with the problem here of mob rule, which is the problem with a pure democracy, right? Where 40% of people who don't pay any federal income tax, they're always typically going to vote for the 60% to pay more.
Yes.
So that's a problem. It doesn't mean that it's right. For example, you can have enough people who vote to keep slavery because they have slaves. It doesn't mean that it's right. And I would also argue that taking money from someone else, especially income that they have worked to earn, that can arguably be in a form of indentured servitude. Yeah. So let's go to this. People start off with, well, this is just, come on, you'd be changing history, precedent. Actually, no. So before the Civil War, we didn't have federal income tax. The federal government, they basically relied on what Donald Trump just talked about. Tariffs, excise taxes, for most of their revenue. Let me give you a brief history lesson here. In 1861, the first federal income tax came to be to fund the Civil War. Government started the first federal income tax. It was supposed to be a temporary measure, and the rate was like 3% on incomes, approximately. That's what we were looking at back then. Okay. Then in 1872, it was repealed. This is what I believe Donald Trump was referring to there. In 1895, the Supreme Court struck down the federal income tax as unconstitutional. The case, we have the reference there, is Pollock versus Farmer Loan and Trust Company. Again, all references available, link in the description. I'm just giving you the ins and outs of history. So if someone tells you, I want you to be prepared. Well, come on, you're going to say we do away with the income tax? Well, for a huge portion of the history of this country, we did not have it. And if you're talking about precedent, the Supreme Court said it is unconstitutional.
Because it was unconstitutional.
Exactly. That happened. Then in 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified to overcome that Supreme Court decision. So then Congress, they immediately passed the Revenue Act of 1913, and it basically established a permanent federal income tax. The rates were anywhere from 1% to 7%. So in other words, even when they're going, okay, we're going to do this to try and bypass and basically render the Supreme Court moot on this point. Yeah. All right, guys, we're all on board with the federal income tax. And that means they had a meeting. At that point, it was radical. And they proposed a rate. And someone said, I don't know, 8%? And they said, no! Are you out of your mind, sir? We're not animals. We are civilized. Let's say 1% to 7%.
I'll have to find the quote for this, but that was an argument used. They said at some point, maybe they're saying that he would be even possibly 10% of your income. And that is a lie to get you not to vote for this.
Right, exactly.
It's way higher. I don't know who said it, but it was a quote that I came across. I was like, holy crap.
Just like there was the same argument when women got the right to vote. And there was some guy like, if you will give them the right to vote, I guarantee you their first act will be to ban liquor. They were like, shut up, Reginald. Then 4 months later, well, me. Very first thing. Now, from 1917 to 1945, of course, the income tax rates, they just ballooned. Yeah. To fund, world wars. So in World War I, the top marginal tax rate reached about 77%. Yeah. World War II, the top marginal tax rate reached 94%. Now, I know that's why Bernie Sanders supports the 50% income tax. To be fair, very few people were actually paying those rates because of all the loopholes.
Yes, but nobody should pay those rates.
Nobody should ever pay those rates.
Should pay those rates.
Zero people ever should pay.
You're saying I'll get to keep 6% of my money?
Yeah, exactly.
Vote for you.
Yeah. And the left acts as though you live in an alternate reality. Like, you live in the reality where someone continues to work to earn 6 cents on every dollar.
Ugh. No.
So then we saw, what people call like the first wave of fascism. Ronald Reagan, 1986, the Tax Reform Act, which I know some people, they hear the faint sound of Hitler in the distance.
I hear the marching.
Yeah. He wanted to simplify the tax code. So he lowered the top rate from 50% to 28%. Reduced the number of tax brackets as well to try and simplify it. This brings us to today. Federal income tax rates anywhere from 10 to 37%.
That's wrong. I'm sorry. Federal income tax rates are anywhere between 0 and 37%.
That's true. That's right. 0 and 37%.
40% of people who enjoy the 0% tax bracket right now.
40% of people pay 0. And the rest of you, 60% pay 10 to 37%. If you live in California with the state tax, you're basically paying half of every dollar once you reach that rate.
I only pay 4%. Don't tell.
Good for you. And don't tell. You shouldn't say that on air. Now, because now people know. You really will need Tax Network USA. Yeah.
Call now.
So let me give you a number here. The annual federal income tax, it amounts to, when you take all of it collected, to $2.2 trillion. That is half of all the annual revenue collected by the federal government, meaning half of all the money, and it's not nearly enough because, of course, we have an incredible deficit, is your income tax. So this brings us to, okay, do you guys feel like you have a briefer there? How could we potentially abolish the income tax? Can it be done? The answer is yes. Will it be done? I don't know. But here's an option. And no one ever thinks of this. Just stay with me here. Mm-hmm. It's a twist.
Yeah.
Spend less. So if the government spends a little bit less,
doesn't make sense.
Maybe they wouldn't have to take your money at force, at gunpoint. Let me give you some examples here. The biggest costs that we have here in government, like Medicare, Medicaid, other healthcare programs, $1.73 trillion.
Well, that's almost enough right there.
Yeah, right there. Social Security, $1.35 trillion. And the benefits, by the way, begin at the age of 65. Let me give you an example as to why. Because life expectancy was far lower when Social Security initially passed. Men were 58 years old. Today they go to 75. Women were 62 years old. Today they go to 80 years old. That'd be funny.
Ripe old age of 8.
It's just a bunch of New Year's babies dying. Now, we can either raise the age or change Social Security. The reason that nobody wants to address this is because you have a lot of people going, well, I paid in. Well, sure, but you're being paid out some money that isn't there. At some point, there's going to need to be some kind of reform, especially when you also look at the ratio of retirees per worker. You can go back to a video I did in 2010 talking about that. Let's continue. Military defense. The budget is $820 billion. Income security is what they call it. That's $775 billion. That would include things like SNAP, housing assistance, right, unemployment benefits. So here's the thing. If you actually spent less money and you took less money from people, the argument can be made. Of course, you'll find experts to line up on CNN who will tell you that those experts are wrong, meaning the other experts, not them. You'd have a better economy because there'd be more money to go around and you would have more jobs, which, by the way, could reduce our deficit naturally because there's actually a point where you could increase revenue by allowing people to keep more of their own money. And at the same time, that revenue isn't being taken by force, but being used when you spend your money. Let's go to another key line item. Interest on debt, $658 billion. I know, crazy idea, potential solution. And it's just me, Mr. Reductive. Stop borrowing so much.
Put the credit card down.
The interest on the debt is $658 billion. That's not something that even creates any value. It's basically a punishment.
That's almost as much as the federal government loses to fraud every year.
Yeah, exactly. That's another thing. Was it $250 to $500 billion a year?
On average.
Unaccounted for. No idea where it went. So option number one was to perhaps reduce spending. Okay.
Radical.
Here's another. Here's option number two. Okay. Find different ways other than stealing money to generate revenue. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a forward thinker. So people have always complained about this. The VAT tax. Well, that's a VAT tax. That's a value-added tax. Yes. So a value-added tax is a tax that's assessed on the value being added to a product at different stages of production. Basically, it means a consumption tax. Basically, it means that if you pay no income tax, you'll end up paying some tax when you purchase goods, right? When you consume products, goods, or services. In that way, you have more choice over the amount of taxes that you pay. And if you're, for example, saving, it gives you the choice to save even more because it's not being taken out automatically. Now, I know you have people on the left who say, actually, a VAT tax disproportionately harms the poorest among us because, they're basically only purchasing the daily consumables, the necessities, whereas wealthy people, they have some luxury purchases, but it disproportionately affects those who are poor because it's a higher percentage of their income. Okay, I would tell you that the income tax disproportionately affects the middle class. And by the way, lower middle class, upper middle class, all the way through the wealthy, because if they pay federal income tax, they're also still paying some kind of a sales tax, and 40% of Americans don't pay anything. It doesn't work. I don't care what communists or socialists tell you. It is not fair for a family making $60,000 a year to pay thousands of dollars in taxes and someone who doesn't work or contribute paying nothing while receiving benefits at the cost of said family. We often act like it's just Jeff Bezos and someone working in the factory. Well, newsflash, the person working in the factory is paying income tax. But there are a lot of people in this country who don't pay any income tax. And it's not Bezos, it's you. Hey, let me ask you this. Do you pay income tax? If you are out of college, you're watching this, I bet you pay income tax. 40%? In other words, go into a store, look around. Almost half of those people don't go through the raping you have to endure every year of income tax.
Yeah.
But it's always the class warfare. So, a consumption-based tax would allow you to have more control and choice over your own finances. So you replace the income tax with a federal sales tax on some goods that currently doesn't necessarily maybe exist. It could theoretically be done. George is a lawyer here who was talking about it under Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution, which is also, if you read that, consumption-based.
Yep.
Something else you could do, you could lease more federal lands for energy. Energy companies pay the federal government to drill for resources, right? You could charge them. You could work within those taxes if you want to talk about people who can spare it while not hurting American worker, American middle class, even small American business owners, oil, coal, natural gas, renewables. Of course, we get to the idea of tariffs. Again, this is about how could you replace the income tax. Trillions of dollars can be cut if we reduce spending. That's a thing no one wants to talk about. And there are other ways to increase revenue. You could have tariffs. This is what we did before. That's what Donald Trump was referring to. This is really, it's more like a throwback when he talks about tariffs. It's not new. It's a throwback.
Very old.
You can use tariffs as an incentive to get other countries to buy more of our goods. Hey, while people work to create those goods, we could produce more goods, right? You could also, actually, I think we have a clip right now.
Yeah.
Donald Trump has actually talked about this, and of course, to the left's chagrin, many times.
The European Union is almost as bad as China. They don't accept your cars. They don't accept your farm products, but they send their farm products here and they send their cars here by the millions and millions. So if China or any other country charges 100 or 200% tax, then we will charge them 100 or 200% tax. My message to every business in the world is very simple. Come make your product in America, and we will give you among the lowest taxes of any nation on earth. But if you don't make your product in America, which is your prerogative, then very simply you will have to pay a tariff, differing amounts, but a tariff which will direct hundreds of billions of dollars and even trillions of dollars into our treasury.
You could use those to punish countries that undercut the United States, our competitiveness in the international stage. You could use it to even the playing field because other countries put tariffs on our goods. You also have to deal with the fact that places like China are basically using de facto slave labor. Basically, you can use this to keep other countries and companies honest and keep ours competitive. So you can reduce costs. The left will tell you that you cannot. You can find other ways to generate revenue outside of taking yours by force. The left will tell you that you cannot. But I don't mind their suggestion of renting out Camp David. It looks like a place where I could kick back.
Relax a bit.
So, where we are is yes. And you can comment below. And check the references. We didn't have an income tax. We have precedent where the income tax was seen as unconstitutional.
Yep.
We do not need an income tax. There are ways to do it. It needs to be done carefully. It needs to be a multi-pronged approach. And I don't know that we would ever have another opportunity outside of Donald Trump in this second term.
Yeah.
Again, he would need to take an axe to this. And I also want to leave you with this. If you wonder, well, hold on a second, if we didn't have income tax and it was ruled unconstitutional, and at first it was a really basic rate, like 3%, how do we get to this point where we have these complicated brackets and 37% income tax? I've done a lot of videos on this gentleman. Karl Marx believed that a progressive tax system would not only redistribute wealth, but it would destroy, and when we say the bourgeoisie, he would definitely be referring to middle-class Americans, just to be clear.
Right, and he said capitalism too.
Yes.
Like it would destroy capitalism because it would create class warfare.
Yep, and it was really clearly stated in Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto where he said, this nit is stupid and lay whoa. I'm sorry.
That's a
direct quote.
It is.
Karl Marx liked the N-word.
He did a lot. Stuck the land.
Hard R. Didn't like the blacks. He said this,
Different one.
An advanced communist nation will require a heavy progressive or graduated income tax. He knew what it would do. He knew the consequences. It was by design. And maybe it's just a coincidence that today's progressive left has fallen for it in the United States hook, line, and sinker. Hey, if you like this video, you can comment below. We always appreciate your feedback. Or click one of these, which will be similar as far as rebuttals, claims, truth. Maybe it changed my mind. Or sometimes we talk about the difference between men and women, how dogs are different from cats. Airline food, no punchline, just premises, because this is the internet in the 21st damn century.